Hello and welcome to the Living Wholeheartedly podcast. My name is Heather Morris and I'm the General Secretary of the Methodist Church in Ireland. As a connection, as a church family, we're committed to living wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world. In this podcast series, to which we hope you will subscribe, we're going to hear and tell stories. We're going to have honest conversations about what wholehearted Christian faith looks like today. A faith that is lived out in the real world every day. A faith that doesn't shy away from hard questions. A faith that's committed to working for change where there's injustice or poverty or lack of opportunities. Living wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world. You're welcome to the Living Wholeheartedly podcast. Our guest today is the Most Revd Pat Storey, who's the Bishop of Meath and Kildare. Pat, you're really welcome. It's great to be able to have this conversation. As you know, we're thinking as the Methodist Church in Ireland about living wholeheartedly as followers of Jesus for the transformation of the world. Can you tell us in that context a bit about you and your faith journey and what living wholeheartedly looks like for you?
Certainly, Heather, and thank you for asking me. I came up really in a non-churched family. So when people see the collar around your neck, especially a purple one, I think they assume that you were always religious, but actually we really didn't go to church at all. So I went to university with a friend from the same school, and the only thing I really knew about Penny was that she was a Christian, and I was thinking, oh my goodness, she's going to cramp my style. That's not what I planned to do at university. But actually, of course, she worked on me, and I met a lot of her friends, and there was just a sense that they had something that I didn't. And I don't like people having something that I don't. So just very gradually, I think I started to read the Gospels. Really, personality of Jesus sprang out to me. And I made a commitment of faith, at some point in my first year. And I would say it probably felt almost an immediate call to leadership, to Christian leadership, but that didn't happen for a very long time. And so living wholeheartedly for me, sometimes I feel is more successful than others. In that I feel like I'm an ordinary human person with foibles and strengths and weaknesses, and likewise in the job, I bring strengths and weaknesses to it. But for me, I suppose it's about surrender. Okay. And I'm not very good at surrender. So that's been a real learning curve for me is, he must increase, I must decrease. That's a life journey, I think. So for me, wholehearted living for Jesus is really about surrender, daily surrender. So every time I have a small decision, every time I have a big decision, it's about just centering your life, I think, around Christ. And as I say, some days that's more successful than others.
Tell us more about that, because I certainly echo with that call to surrender, but the struggle with it as well. Day by day, what does that look like?
I suppose it's even in your relationships, I'm sure my husband would say I needed to work on surrender. But even in marriage, I think you're constantly learning to surrender your own needs or opinions to someone else. And that, that can be a struggle. I have a busy timetable, but I have a husband, I have children, I have grandchildren. And the struggle to kind of get the time, the appropriate amount of time and commitment to them, because they're really important to me and to my life. But I live 4 hours away, certainly from one child, and I live about 9.5 hours flight from the other one who's in Vancouver. So it's trying to weigh up things like time commitment. How do you surrender to Christ in your time commitments? I'm not one that says I'm too busy for a day off, because I just think that's not the way I want to live. That's not the way I choose to live, and I'm not sure it's scriptural. So I do try and get the day off. I do try and get the holidays and the headspace and the retreats. Yeah. So I would say in relationships and in time, it's learning to surrender what you want and what you need to what you feel Christ has for you. But that includes things like family time and holidays and retreats. Because if I'm not right with the Lord, I'm not really any use to anybody.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the wholehearted living flows out of that, I can see.
Yeah.
So very early on, after you made a commitment, that sense of God calling you to leadership. And here you are, a bishop, first woman bishop in the Church of Ireland. What does that day-to-day life look like for you in the role of bishop?
Well, it's very varied and very different. And obviously 2 years of COVID have had an immense impact on that. And I didn't enjoy COVID. I'm an extrovert. I struggled with COVID. I kind of enjoyed the first few weeks. And then after that, I really did struggle with it because I felt like my job fell off a cliff.
Okay.
Because it's all about people and it's all about face to face. You go down to a parish, you have coffee after the services, you meet people, you go and visit different parishes every Sunday. And for a long time, even churches were closed. So I suppose for a long time, I wondered what it was for.
Okay.
But actually, in some ways, I reflect on that and I think that wasn't the worst thing. To sort of strip yourself from your role and really consider, are you okay without your role? So that was actually a real learning curve. You know, who am I without being bishop? Because I've been a bishop nearly 9 years now, and you kind of do get used to it, and you get used to all that comes with that. But since COVID, beginning to go back to, I would spend maybe 20% of my time in my study preparing for things. I'd usually have a speaking engagement most weeks. I have Sundays. I'd have church meetings. So I love it because it's got a lot of variety. I wouldn't be able to, I admire my daughter who's a teacher who, 8 o'clock every morning is in the same place and 4 o'clock every afternoon is leaving the same place. And I couldn't do that. I love being out and about. I love waking up in the morning and thinking, if I have a free day, like what'll I do with today? So very low boredom threshold, I'm afraid, which is both good and bad.
And just leadership writ through you.
Yeah.
I mean, looking at you and the role you've had and the influence you've had, that's so clear that that's God's gift. What are your dreams for the diocese?
Yeah, I mean, leadership is an interesting one, isn't it? Because it doesn't take away from the fact that you're basically pastor to the pastors, and that'd be really important to me. And I hope that they would know that that's my first priority, because being a parish minister it's no picnic.
No.
And I remember it because, that's what I was doing whenever I was pulled out of that to be a bishop, and I loved it. But it's very demanding. And so who cares for the pastors if, the bishop doesn't? So one of my priorities would be definitely, caring for the pastors. And I suppose I would feel that my call to leadership is pastoral, but it's also to lead a diocese somewhere. So I'd like it to go from A to B. I might know what B is necessarily. And that's a sort of a weekly, monthly thing about discerning God's will for the diocese. Like every church in the land, the impact of COVID has been smaller congregations, lower finances. There are real challenges ahead. And I think particularly young families, and, you can't blame them. They've woken up on a Sunday morning and discovered having hot chocolate in their jammies with their kids. Watching church online is actually very attractive.
Yes.
We've got to make something that wants them, that they want to come back. But I think there's lots of hope. I really do. I'm very optimistic about the church. Good. And one of the reasons is because the church isn't mine. The church is the Church of Jesus Christ, and he's looked after it for a long time. So I don't feel a burden about the church, but I do feel a call. And I think those two things actually are really very different. I'm not anxious about the church, but I realise that, I have a calling and a vocation to help alongside others to lead the diocese forward. So I think at the minute, I found before the summer clergy are very tired and traumatised by COVID. So we left it for the summer to kind of regather ourselves, I think. And November, we have a clergy conference, and we'll maybe begin then small steps of, so how do we move forward here? It's treating people as human beings who, have needs and families of their own, but also people who also have a vocation to lead forward Christ Church. So we do have a responsibility to think, okay, where is B and we're at A, and how do we get from A to B? And I think that'll be the first step, is beginning to look ahead, but maybe gently this time.
Yeah. And I love that picture of not having a burden and having hope. That really is transformative, actually.
Yes.
Whatever our role and calling, where do you see the glimmers of hope?
In people and in parishes on the ground, people who have dealt with, for instance, bereavement through COVID and maybe haven't had the death of a parent or a sibling or a child and a funeral of the same that they would like and that they would have hoped for, and the immense strength and resilience of people who've really not even been able maybe to be with a parent when they died. My dad died just 10 days before COVID, 10 days before lockdown. So grateful, but he didn't live to see this because it would have been very difficult to try and navigate that. But also that, I got the death and funeral I would have wanted for him. But for a lot of people, that has taken immense strength and resilience. And I see, faith can go either way in those situations, can't it? People can either feel certainly a temporary rejection of God because of their suffering, but a lot of people cling to God in difficult times. And I've seen people and, clergy reinvent themselves. Maybe people who weren't strong in IT having to reinvent themselves with online worship and that sort of thing. And there's been a lot of good learning. There's been a lot of trauma, but there's been a lot of good learning. And so I see the glimmers of hope in parishes that are beginning now to have their coffees after church, beginning to reach out again, beginning to have their mums and toddlers or their food banks or even their parish sales or, life beginning to, like God lighting a wee bit of a flare again.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the living wholeheartedly coming out of that. Tell us, if you would, a bit of the personal bit. So, you and I can chat in a context like this about living wholeheartedly, but sometimes that's really tough. Have there been times when living wholeheartedly has been tough for you as Pat?
Yeah, there have. And as I say, particularly through COVID, I find it really challenging not to have access to people and not to have access to family. So there's about 6 months during the second tranche of COVID where I couldn't get up north. We had a 2 kilometre limitation where you were walking the same walks for months, or it felt like that anyway. But I didn't have access to family. And I suppose I was struck by the fact that leadership is sacrificial.
Okay.
That we move where we're called. And that's actually not always easy. Now, when I moved from Derry, I left behind my daughter and son who were, my son was finishing off a master's, my daughter had just got married, they were Derry based. They say I left home, not them, and that's true. And not realising maybe at the time what a sacrifice that would be, but during COVID that was kind of like a big red flag in terms of, God has chosen you to live this life, but actually it's not all a picnic. It's not all fun and games. There are really difficult times. So I think that during COVID, that really came home to me that actually ministry is a sacrifice of a particular kind.
And how you live that and live it. And going back to what you said earlier about that lack of burden, which comes from trust in God, that the church belongs to Jesus, it's his church, and living that out then personally as well. Is that daily surrender, isn't it? It's that the family are his too.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm not given to anxiety, fortunately. But certainly there were times when, I felt like my 5-year-old grandson, it would have been nice to see him, that maybe, first day at school and all that. And you just feel like sometimes you miss a lot. And that's not easy. It's not easy for a mum and it's not easy for a granny. You want to be there. You want to be there for the first steps and the big deals. And I'm a real family person. And even though my son's in Vancouver, for 3 years running now, I've had to postpone that trip. And, that's really difficult too. It's like, it's definitely not all fun and games. Living wholeheartedly for Jesus doesn't mean that every day you're walking along, skipping and singing. It's real. But to me, leadership isn't a burden. Because I'm not given to anxiety, it's not a burden, but I take it very seriously.
So tell me, I want to know how you do that day by day. Is that about a pattern of a prayer life? You mentioned retreats earlier on. How do you make sure that it is that wholehearted living that's upfront about the joys and the struggles? Is that about a pattern of life, Pat, or what's for you?
I think partly. I'm not very good at sitting still. So for me, a lot of prayer goes on when I'm walking, driving and swimming. Because I just like movement. Even though I hurt my back a couple of years ago and they were saying, you need to do Pilates. Well, I just find it so boring because it was, there were stretches and, I'm sure it's very good for you.
It is very good.
But it wasn't for me. Person. I would rather be swimming,
Right.
I just like movement. But COVID was good for me in one sense in that I started every morning. We have a wee blue chair by a window, and I started every morning for had slow mornings, which I wasn't used to. So I got up, didn't shower, didn't get dressed, had my breakfast in that wee blue chair, probably sat for an hour, and that instilled a pattern in me that I have continued. And it's not that I didn't do that before, but it was shorter and faster because I was going out somewhere. But that taught me to slow down and to really think and pray. So I've tried to continue that pattern. But I think, I do think that walking and swimming and driving seem to be the times when I really feel like I like to be alone. I like my own company. And those are usually in my own company when I can really think and pray and hear, hopefully listen. So yeah, there is a pattern, but it's not necessarily sitting in a chair all the time. A lot of my prayer life, I don't read the scriptures when I'm driving, I'm sure you'd be glad to know. But a lot of my prayer life is daily movement. So 20 times a day when I'm doing something else.
Exactly.
But that's just the way I roll.
It's great. And that's what living wholeheartedly looks like.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things we've been thinking about, as individuals in a church and as churches and as a church, that actually living wholeheartedly will look like different things in different contexts and in different personalities. And that's all right.
And it's allowing people that.
That's it.
And, that's why retreats are very challenging for me, but also very important because that's the time I slow down and I stop. And so I try and plan in a good sort of 3-day retreat twice a year. And those are bliss. Yeah. And even though I don't want to slow down, when I do, I just get so much from it because I don't normally do it. So, I really do. My retreats are sacrosanct.
Brilliant. Thank you. So we've thought about the personal and you've helped us to think a bit about churches and those signs of hope. And as we think about sort of congregation societies, our language, Pat, across the island of Ireland, as they begin to re-engage that process you've talked about, we've been thinking about, well, what are the barriers? What are the things that hold us back? What's your view on that? Are there things, as you see parishes re-emerging from COVID, things that hold them and us back? And how might we work with that?
I mean, one very basic thing is money.
Okay.
Money and resources. Like we need those to do things. We had a diocesan review a few years ago, but, because of COVID, we haven't really been able to do an awful lot with it. But it was pointing out that really, if you do what you've always done, you get what you've always got.
Exactly.
We need to do new things. So I would say tiredness and fatigue post-COVID, maybe lack of money and resources, I think are some of the barriers, or lack of imagination. But we're trying to do a few new things. And, we kind of call it Parish Plus, because it's not that the parish isn't enough. And it's not that we're abandoning parish by any stretch of the imagination, but it's Parish Plus. What new little things could we do? So, we've a new project in the cathedral coming, and we've asked every parish to think of one new thing.
Brilliant.
One small step, one new thing that you might do in some area of parish life, and it'll look different for everybody. We've a big mental health programme in the Church of Ireland at the minute called Mind Matters, which I am fortunate enough to chair, because I really care about mental health, and I think that's one of the things that some of the parishes will be doing, would be centering on mental health, maybe having a small mental health project that might look like a walk every week with other people. It might be very small and seem very insignificant, but actually for a lot of people it is life-giving. So there are lots of challenges, but I think lots of opportunities. But it's like having, I need as a diocesan leader to have the money and resources to help that. But I also need people to be creative and inventive in their own space. It's not for me to say, you and Tullamore should do this and you and Mullingar should do that, and in Navan you have to do that. It's for them to work that out for them, what living wholeheartedly looks like for them.
That's it, which is challenge and opportunity, isn't it? That's one of the things we're discovering, that it's far easier to lift a plan off a shelf, isn't it? And actually discerning what God is calling us to in our different contexts is really exciting, but also takes the time and prayer and reflection that you've been talking about, and the leadership to enable that as well. Talked about dreams for diocese, dreams for church, and you're a partnership person too, and working with others in all sorts of different ways. And one of our denominations are working together in covenant. I'm grateful for personal friendship
Yeah,
with you
absolutely.
and sparking lots of ideas on that. Talk to me about dreams for the church, beyond even Church of Ireland. What would you love to see?
Well, I'm just back from the Lambeth conference, you know,
Yes.
where 650 bishops spent 2 weeks together from all over the world. And I suppose it was realising how different the church is in other places and how much I take for granted as well. So in the West, you know, I met, for instance, the Bishop of the Amazon, who happens to be a woman. And she was just saying, you know, takes her 3 days by boat to get anywhere. She's fighting off wild animals and pirates. And I'm thinking, Meath and Kildare's looking better all the time. So just realising that the church is different in every context. And in many ways, we're blessed in the West. And yet, you know, it is sometimes the African and Central American churches that are growing. So again, living wholeheartedly looks different for every church, every denomination, every part of the Anglican communion for us. I suppose the key thing is that we're doing it, you know, no matter what that looks like. And my hope is that we are living wholeheartedly for Christ, and that we are surrendering to his will and his voice, and that we are listening to that voice in whatever context we're in. And that might seem like a cop-out because I don't have a strategic plan for that, but it's just hoping and praying that in partnership, because we are all in partnership for the gospel, you know, that living wholeheartedly and surrender and hopes for the future is something that we share, and that if we share it, there's the impetus to do something together.
Absolutely. And I love what you've just said about just doing it and doing it. I think that people of peace, and you do know actually those contexts where we're being called to partner and just get on with this for the transformation of the world and for Jesus' glory. Yeah. Pat, thank you so much. I've really appreciated the conversation.
You're more than welcome.
And thank you for this today. And thank you for joining us and listening or watching to this podcast. Can I encourage you, as I've done before, to subscribe so that you can follow on with the other conversations which will follow on from this throughout the year as we help each other, as we partner with each other in living wholeheartedly. But as I finish, can I pray for you
That'd be
and for the
lovely.
things that have come up?
Thank you so much.
Loving God, we're so grateful to you for the privilege of partnership in the gospel. So grateful to you for what you're doing across the world, whether that's in the Amazon or Meath and Kildare or across other parts of the island of Ireland. And today we pray for your blessing for Pat as she continues to lead, that you would bless and inspire her, that you would lead her clearly as she leads and works with others. We pray for your blessing on the diocese that she serves and on the Church of Ireland. And we surrender ourselves into your hands, that today, in all that we are, the love and beauty of Jesus might be seen. And Lord, as we live surrendered lives, our prayer is that we would be enabled by your Spirit to live wholeheartedly for your glory, that the world might know that Jesus Christ is Lord. For we ask it in his name. Amen.